Did you know that at this hunting lodge in the Austrian countryside, over 20 years before the first shot was fired, 2 bullets would set in motion the First World War? Pretty much everyone believes that the First World War began at this bridge in Sarajevo. It was here, just next to this peaceful little river, that Archduke Franz Ferdinand was shot in the neck by Black Hand assassin Gavrilo Princip. And they are correct. I'm not here to debate that. Without that bullet, we would live in a very different world. But nothing exists in a vacuum, and so I want to take you back nearly 20 years before, to a hunting lodge in the countryside of Austria, because that Archduke wasn't supposed to be in Sarajevo. The man who was supposed to lose his neck that day was actually Franz's horny loser cousin, Rudolf. The only problem was, Rudolf was already dead. Born in 1858, Rudolf Franz Karl Joseph was the 3rd child and first son of the Emperor of Austro-Hungary, at that time one of the world's most powerful men, which meant that from the very second of his birth, it wasn't just expected, but also legally ordained that he would be the heir to that giant, sprawling imperial throne. And yet, although the throne would long for him, he wished for a seat at a different table, because life came with expectations that Rudolf neither wished for nor was really truly capable of meeting. He wasn't some vicious tyrant like his father had dreamed. He was soft, meek, some might even say a romantic. And perhaps with the right parenting, that sensitive young man might have found his way into becoming a great leader someday, but that wasn't in Rudolf's cards. His father was too busy running an empire to care about his son, and his mother had more important guests to host over tea. So at 6 years old, he would be handed off to one of his father's most successful generals in the hopes that a strict tradition of militarism might provide him the imperial backbone he'd been born without. Softness was not a virtue among the royalty, and that would be very much reflected in the bitter, heavy hand that his adopted sire would constantly lay upon him. After all, this was not a boy, nor even a child, but heir to one of the greatest thrones on earth, and the beatings would continue until he understood that. So as would be the case with many children of his time, Rudolf's upbringing would have been filled with nearly endless abuse. Only with his heightened position and expectations, there was somehow an even greater sadness attached to the blows. Rather than having the intended effect of shaping him into a strong leader, it broke his young will and left him a meek and depressive teen. However, his life was not all misery. He had passions, they just weren't for the throne. As a teenager, he'd be introduced to geology, and from childhood onwards, he'd spend his free time and excess wealth in the pursuit of collecting rare rocks from across the globe. With a natural curiosity, one can imagine that had he lived to see the crown, he may well have turned his empire into a world leader in scientific discovery, something his overbearing father was not particularly impressed with. And yet, the crown remained his. So fit for the role or not, life continued as the court demanded. Rudolf would follow the rules as best as he could and prepare himself for his dreaded imperial ascent. When his family demanded he marry King Leopold of Belgium's daughter Stephanie, he understood it wasn't his decision, and 2 years later they'd produce their only child, a daughter named Elizabeth. But in doing so, he'd give his wife at least one, if not more, STDs that he'd picked up pursuing his second passion. Like I said, he was a romantic. After his daughter's birth and seeing his wife stricken with venereal disease, Rudolf would grow tired of his new family and begin a series of affairs that were even less well hidden than his growing alcoholism. By 1886, just 5 years after they'd married, and the diseases he'd spread had rendered his wife sterile, which in the eyes of the crown made her useless. The only child that Stephanie would ever give him was a girl, which under the rules of the Austrian monarchy meant that he would go without an heir. Even if he did take the throne, his lineage would never keep it. Yet another giant log on the burning pile of disappointments his father now found in him. So sick, drunk, and a joke among the court, Rudolf fell deeper into his depression and began to expand both his drinking and his affairs. By the late 1880s, he'd start to talk openly of suicide. After becoming involved with a Viennese actress by the name of Mitzi, He proposed that they die like a funnier named Romeo and Juliet, which she laughed off and then later informed the police about, but what were they going to do? He was the prince. So he found someone a little less mature. In November of 1888, he'd begin sleeping with the 17-year-old daughter of one of his noblemen, a girl named Marie, and she'd be much less opposed to his little fantasy. She was a teenager in the height of her angst. Of course she found it romantic. In the depths of her teenhood, with her own family troubles to contend with, she saw her entire life as little more than a way for her parents to continue climbing the social ladder. To quote Marie, "Ever since I was a little girl, my mother treated me like something she meant to dispose of at her best advantage." Hearing of the crown prince from her own family's gossip, she decided that he would be the lion who she wished to tame. So rather than being tricked by him, as one might imagine, it would be her who would search him out, maneuvering herself so that he might take advantage of her youth. And given his nature, that didn't turn out to be all too difficult, their very first meeting, and he'd already taken the bait. Her family was furious. Mistresses climb no social ladder. They were expendable toys who'd leave the tryst far more tainted than those who'd infected them, and perhaps even worse to her socialite family. They were friends with Rudolph's wife, so if nothing else, this was going to make high tea kind of awkward. But Marie didn't care. She was a 17-year-old who thought she was in love, and as anyone who has been that age can tell you, it's not exactly a high point of rationality. It was in her that 30-year-old Romeo would find his Juliet. And on January 29th, 1889, after hosting a family dinner with his wife and daughter, Rudolph would excuse himself, get in a carriage, and rush to his now infamous countryside hunting lodge called Mayerling. There, he would secretly meet with his child lover. When he shot the bullet that pierced her skull, that young girl would call it love. It was just over 2 months to the day since they'd first met. She'd claim in the note to her sister that she had gone blissfully into that great beyond, but I think that's just a bit too poetic for what was more practically speaking. A bunch of brains exploded over a bedsheet. Rudolph wouldn't die as quickly, however. He would sit for hours in contemplation. Nobody knows for certain exactly what he did in the time between her death and his own, but one can imagine it wouldn't please the YouTube censors anyway. So regardless of how it came to be, by the time his servant came to check on him in the morning, he'd long since eaten a bullet himself. The First World War was still 15 years away, but with Rudolph's death, so too would die the empire. Because although it was only 1889, with the death of their sensitive heir apparent, things would change in Austro-Hungary. Instead of the crown being handed to the liberal Rudolph, with no heir and little passion beyond science, it would instead be passed to his uncle, and with his death, in turn his cousin Franz. And unlike Rudolph, Franz was a military man, rising through the ranks as one would expect of a leading member of the royal family. By the time of Rudolph's death, he had already been made a colonel, and within a few years, he'd be a general. A far cry from the geologist that he'd replaced. And that meant that when the Serbian crisis evolved to the point of requiring Austrian intervention, it was Franz that the emperor would send to quell it. Now heir to the throne and a leader of the army, it was expected that his presence alone would be enough to instill imperial authority back amongst his people. But instead, his neck would catch a bullet, and the road to World War I would begin. There's no true way to say that had Rudolph not died that day, the war wouldn't have happened. Had a young girl not felt the pull of suicidal tendencies, perhaps we'd never injured ourselves a Hitler. It's too hard to judge. After all, his father still reigned at the start of the war, and the powder was already all in the kegs. Franz was just a match among the many. But history's not a straight line, and Rudolph would have most certainly not been sent to Sarajevo, so who knows? Maybe under his syphilitic leadership, Austro-Hungary might have found another way. Maybe Europe might not have joined them in that pointless murder-suicide. Or perhaps I'm just being romantic. This is Rare Earth.